the final presentation will be by Mario Gonzalez Corso and Orlando Justo from Lehman College, Self-Employment in Cuba, an update. We have two discussants. I think we have one of them here, Luis Locay from the University of Miami, and Carlos Segle hopefully will join us a little later. So without further ado, Ted.
All right, let me start by apologizing for overrunning the last panel so that we're behind schedule here. It was totally my fault. I'm supposed to be the dictator, and I was the dicta blanda, right? But in any case, I'm here to present a paper that is the work, the fruit of work by myself and Arch Ritter on a forthcoming book that should see the bookstores all over the country in September. It's called, what is it called? Empresarial Cuba, right? And it is basically a study of self-employment in Cuba, its history, its development, and a comparison between Fidel Castro's policies that were extremely restrictive, ideological in the past, and the new policies introduced by Raul Castro, essentially asking the question, if you change the director of the play and you change the script of the play, are you going to have a better play as a result? Will the outcome be any different? And has the outcome for self-employment been any different? Our basic argument, and the basic argument of this part of the paper, is that while there has been a quantum leap with the numbers of self-employed people more than tripling over the past 3 or 4 years since 2010, and which has been very impressive and is a significant change from about 150,000 self-employed individuals in 2010 to now almost 500,000 self-employed individuals. There's also been a slight but important growth in the number of occupations in which one can become self-employed from 178 in 2010 under the new regulations launched then to 201, including 5 or 6 of them that could border on professional skilled activities, but that's only 5 or 6 out of 210. So the good news is that there's been growth, there's been a quantitative leap forward, but there has been a qualitative step backwards, or at least a qualitative estancamiento, kind of frozen. So if you look at the details behind the headlines and you look at the laws and you look at the regulations, you'll see that there are still many, though less, many restrictions on the kind of people who can become self-employed and on the internal dimensions of that. So I'm going to begin here then with a quote from Raul Castro from December 2013. Quote, "Recent events have revealed a lack of control on the part of the government institutions leading to illegalities in the exercise of self-employment, which were not confronted with the necessary resolve, creating an environment of impunity and stimulating the accelerated growth of activities that have never been authorized. Problems should be identified before they appear, and if they raise their heads, we must act immediately without vacillation, which is always preferable to paying the political cost that comes from inertia and passivity in requiring compliance with the law." So if there's a characteristic of Raul Castro's presidency that some people attribute to him, which is opening up the economy, lessening the restrictions, growing the non-state sector, another characteristic that should be expected from a military man is an insistence, a religious almost insistence on order and control, and to have everything be by the books. Unfortunately, he's the president of Cuba, right? And a Cuba that he and his brother brought into being through 50 years of government. And so he's often trying to kill the demons that he and his brother created, especially in the area of trying to shift the policy towards self-employment. By late 2013, self-employment had achieved this qualitative leap forward, even as it continued to face major qualitative limits on future growth, depth, and dynamism. Veteran Cuba watcher who was with us yesterday, Phil Peters, has perceptibly called this dilemma the hard part, writing that as the state begins the Herculean task of reforming Cuba's large, unproductive, and inefficient state enterprises, it will need, quote, a strong private sector that generates jobs for excess state workers and a larger scale enterprises that can employ professionals and others in large numbers, including in the production of high value added goods and services, end quote. Peters also suggests that the government seems to prefer that the newly launched non-agricultural cooperative sector play this role rather than the private enterprises, the self-employed. Peters bases this assessment on a number of things, including frank declarations from the Cuban leadership to this effect. In fact, in March 2013, Cuba's first vice president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, made the following statement, quote, "We have advanced in what was easiest, in solutions that required less depth in terms of both decision-making and implementation, and now we are left with more important aspects, more decisive for the future development of the country, and also more complex in terms of solutions." So our analysis is kind of, up till now there's been significant change, but they've kind of reached a threshold of what change can happen, of what growth can happen, especially in this non-state sector, unless they're willing to go a step further and a step deeper in terms of the reforms, in terms of qualitative aspects of the reforms, especially as they apply to self-employment, that they haven't been willing to do, that will really allow the self-employment sector to become professionalized, to increase its dynamism in the economy, to create more employment, and to fill lots of the gaps of the retreating state sector, of the inefficiencies in the state sector. The overall numbers of the self-employed, they reached a record of 455,000, and earlier this year, I think now they're reported to be 467,000. This quantitative expansion belies a number of limitations, as well as ideological and frankly political obstacles that continue to limit the sector's growth behind mostly survival-oriented micro-enterprises. If we think about the lunch from yesterday, as eloquent, intelligent, and emprendedora that those 5 women were, if you think about the types of businesses that they ran and the impact that those kind of businesses can have on a larger economy, it would seem to be, to me, very minimal. And I think that those, and this is why I asked them the question, those were likely not representative of the larger sector of self-employment, maybe a better case, maybe not the best case scenario, but a better case scenario of people who run these businesses. And so if that's the case, there's a lot of qualitative change that still needs to happen for these changes to even reach the government's own stated goals. And so what I'll do now is I'm just going to chronicle some of the steps forward, but especially the steps back that happened in the second half of 2013, and then I'll close. How am I doing on time? Okay. Specifically, in the fall of 2013, a set of new regulations were issued on self-employment, which, together with the series of highly unpopular official pronouncements, were aimed at reining in abuses and deformations, as Raul Castro called them, that had taken hold in the sector. This renewed emphasis on law and order was rolled out despite, or perhaps precisely because of the increasingly evident fact that such supposed abusadores were successfully competing against the state sector, creating employment and providing goods and services at lower prices and of better quality and wider variety than state enterprises, renowned for the, quote, exorbitant prices and shoddy quality of their products. That quote is actually from Mark Frank, the Reuters journalist resident in Cuba, who wrote a number of articles in last fall chronicling this kind of step backwards and the reining in. These law and order pronouncements included in the late September prohibition on the resale of imported goods, especially clothing and other materials brought in to Cuba by the mules or the mulas, and also reining in of the household items, of the sale of household items acquired in the state retail sector. Later in early November, after what turned out to be a premature declaration from Fernando Rojas, the Vice Minister of Culture, who said he favored regulation over outright prohibition, he came out and said that, and then like 3 days later, Grandma contradicted him very clearly and said, and outright banned the previously tolerated and unregulated but highly popular self-employment options and consumer options of private cinemas, especially private 3D cinemas, believe it or not, and game rooms where kids and some young adults, right, could play video games ordering them closed immediately with the words cesarán de inmediato en cualquier tipo de actividad por cuenta propia. The popular rejection of this top-down move toward greater order, discipline, and command exposes a fundamental dilemma faced by the Cuban government as it attempts to enact economic reforms that cede space to the private, or as they like to call it, non-state sector. The outright prohibition of activities the government prefers to keep under state monopoly, such as the import-export business and most professions, allows the government to exercise symbolic control over the population and impose an apparent order over citizens and society. We make the rules, you follow the rules. However, this control comes at the cost of pushing all targeted economic activity, along with potential tax revenue, back into the black market, which we should probably hear about in Ellis Rua's presentation, Arriba de la Bola, where much of it lived prior to 2010, as evidenced by the high proportion of cuentapropistas who are found in government surveys to have been laboralmente desvinculado, which is a nice way of saying unemployed, prior to becoming self-employed. This means that they came in to the self-employed sector supposedly unemployed, but it's very likely that the majority of them were already doing what they had been doing, what they became doing in the clandestine market, in the black market. On the other hand, the inclusion and regulation of the many private activities dreamed up and market-tested by Cuba's always inventive entrepreneurial sector would create more legal employment opportunities, a higher quality and variety of goods and services at lower prices, while also increasing tax revenue to target inequality and fund social programs. So that's the good side of giving the space. However, and this is probably the key however, these benefits of the growth in the self-employed sector, the non-state sector, the private sector, these benefits come for the government at the political cost of allowing greater citizen autonomy, wealth and property in private hands, and open competition against long-protected state monopolies. So with this final part, I will close. The micro-enterprise reforms have been a major success in that the self-employment has grown to unprecedented levels, providing a wide variety of goods and services, employment opportunities to Cuban citizens. On the other hand, part of this growth to date seems to have been driven more by the formalization of previously clandestine operators and less by the incorporation of laid-off state workers, which, very important, which was the government's stated goal in reforming the self-employed sector. Moreover, given the near prohibition on professional employment in the small enterprise sector, most of the growth in the non-state employment has been in the lower technology, though nonetheless important, service occupations, and not in the higher technology, value-added professional activities that could contribute more broadly to greater economic efficiency and productivity. The relatively small number of laid-off state workers in the micro-enterprise sector suggests that absorbing large numbers of redundant state workers into micro-enterprise activities will not be easy. For example, when workers in former state enterprises are informed that their place of business has been selected, bing, you won the lottery, has been selected to be part of a transfer to the non-state sector, allowing the workers to become self-employed if they wish, what is the other alternative? They can become unemployed. So it's often, there's one type of self-employment operation that is born by the entrepreneurial Cubans themselves, dreamed up and put into practice. But there's another side to this, which is simply the state getting rid of businesses and saying to people, well, you can be unemployed or figure out how to survive, or you can work at this now as a private enterprise sector, but these are conversions, not things that are born. State sector downsizing also has been difficult to implement in practice. This is in part because few Cubans volunteered to serve on the committees that would identify their fellow workers as disponible for layoff. Thus, This expansion of self-employment can also be seen as an unloading, abandonment, or discharge of thousands of workers, many of whom are unprepared to become effective entrepreneurs. Indeed, as with the creation of non-agricultural cooperatives, there is a difference between self-made entrepreneurs who create their own businesses and state workers who are bureaucratically converted into entrepreneurs when their only other option is to become trabajadores disponibles. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to recognize the contribution of Arch Ritter and Ted Henkin on this paper. If there's anything good about it, please address your comments to them. I'm responsible for all the errors and weaknesses. Take a moment, if you will, and just scan over this brief abstract. Our goal is to kind of look at the Soviet Blatt system, which has often been referred to by Rain and Thales as the mundane entrepreneurship. That sort of entrepreneurship that goes on in centrally planned economies, which are often discarded or not taken to heart by economists because it's not sort of the formal sector or the data on monitoring its performance is rather shallow. We're not talking exclusively about the informal economy or the black economy, but sort of the everyday strategies that survived in the Soviet Union. So we want to kind of look at that and see how it might parallel what's going on in the cuenta propista, the self-employment sector there. With that, let's sort of jump forward. The literature on mundane entrepreneurship, sort of citing Ren and Thales, looking at the Soviet Union is here. Their argument that we're only looking at sort of market economies and to ignore that really excludes an important sector that took place in the Soviet Union before the fall of the Berlin Wall and certainly in Cuba. My work began with Phil Peters in 1998. Phil and I interviewed 154 self-employed workers. It was at the 5-year anniversary mark of Cuenta Propismo. And I wanted to revisit this in the year of 2000. Part of the title of our paper, the realignment, has to do with the lineamientos, about which you're sort of all familiar. So Phil and I were unable to get a sampling frame from the Ministry of Prices and Finances. No surprise there. So our sample had to be a convenience sample. And we carried this out. I think we were the first to sort of do this in large scale 15 years ago, 16 years ago. It was concentrated largely in Havana and Pinar del Rio and some pueblos along the way, along the Carretera Central. I followed up in 2008 and 2011. So we have a 10, we have a 5, a 15, and a 2011 would be I guess that would be a 15-year mark. And I want to present some of those findings. For the purposes of brevity, I'm not going to review the history of self-employment, the stages, the early years, the special period and whatnot. I'll sort of skip that. It's been a seesaw ride, the vicissitudes of self-employment illustrated here in this graph, sort of plateauing until the early mid-2000s and then sort of taking off in the late 2000s. We could bicker about the numbers, perhaps less than 450,000 today. The paper goes into some of the earlier notions of entrepreneurship as put forth by Schumter and Leibenstein, where their great contribution to the entrepreneurship literature was to take the focus on risk-taking and individual small businesses, which of course is very germane to the case of Cuba. The paper looks at 3 types of barriers: suppliers and customers, the legal system, and financial. No time for that. Let's go to the primary data. Again, Peters and I, looking at some of the original work in 1998, one of the surprising things about our survey then was that the large proportion of self-employed workers that had absolutely no complaints about what they were doing. This was in the beginning. Regulation was tight. The crackdown in Paladares in 1995 had taken place. So by 1998, these were sort of the survivors, los sobrevivientes. And they would say things to us like, you know, they liked the newfound liberty, they liked being able to work at home, they liked having a steady flow of cash so they could buy inputs into it. And so we thought that was rather unique. Here are some of the stats. Please take a moment, if you will, and look at the very simple statistical breakdown over time. In 1998, you know, obviously making a good wage, if you compare it to the average physician wage at that time, they were making 165% more. If we look at that as an indicator, that continues. They're even making more money in 2008, 257%. In 2011, again, sort of really doing well compared to the regular state salaries. None of the informants, and these are almost 460 folks, really felt strongly that they were being overtaxed. Everyone would say, you know, we're getting health care, we've had education. Yes, it's not good, it's not the best. So if you look at that very last row, the tax profit percentage, one could argue that it's not much more than FICA, Social Security in the United States. The folks were just sort of welcome to have that sort of liberty of running their own businesses, and that was a theme, I think, that resonated. If you look at the years of schooling in the second row there, you see that over time, sort of more formal training in 2008, and then with sort of the lineamientos and the opening up and the expansion of the number of self-employed workers, the formal years of schooling drops even lower, 10.5 years, so barely high school graduates. Not surprisingly, those that are there have been there for the long haul. Our mean, again, a convenience sample, the mean months in business. These folks had just under 2 years, whatnot. This was a question we asked to each of the three sampling periods, 98, 08, and 11. And I want to jump down here so I can take a look at them. Again, in 1998, if we look at the bottom of the graph and work our way up, really surprising how many folks said, ¿Usted tiene algún desafío? ¿Cuál es el desafío principal que usted tiene que enfrentar? And hugely, we were really surprised with nothing. That certainly goes away in 2008 with the green bar and the red bar in 2011. What does remain as a constant concern is that first variable. There's no wholesaling. No hay mayoristas. So everybody has to buy at the retail level from the state. And their concern was that an inspector came in and said, show us the receipts for 5 pounds of harina, 2 latas de tomate, and anything else in the aceite. If you couldn't show state receipts, you could be shut down, fined, and have your goods confiscated. So over time, wholesaling, really important. And number 2 is the issue of taxation. Licensing, sobre todo. We lumped taxes and licensing into the same category. The monthly fees, for those of you that aren't familiar, you have to pay ahead of time as opposed to afterwards. So let me just sort of conclude. It's a very long paper. Some of the main findings that we have here over this 15-year period, wholesaling really keeps them, the lack of wholesaling, keeps them from gaining a competitive price advantage. It's just really hard. The margins are so small, it's just hard over time to sort of do better than that. The number 2 problem, and consistently throughout this, is the taxes and licensing fee. And again, it's more licensing than it is taxes. The 40-odd% that they're paying for taxes and licensing. For taxes, at the end of the year in February, there seemed to be no major concern. But the monthly fees, rather exorbitant, particularly in restaurants that are charging in dollars and CUCs. That was rather high. Obviously, keeping things sort of from not expanding are the very limited list. That the National Chamber of Commerce is not defining what these legal trades are, but rather the Cuban Communist Party is doing it, absolutely makes no sense. And it was always a point of lightness and joking when we would talk to them about who defines what's legal and what isn't. Other comments, lack of advertising, to hang a shingle off your house, a sign that was vertical versus flush against the building, different licensing fees there. So Radio Bemba, word of mouth, sort of really constraining the spread of this. And I put limited social media, and a lot of people will roll their eyes and go, well, of course there's no social media, but it's amazing how many restaurants you'll go to that have TripAdvisor stickers on their door. And they'll leave and go, please say something. Please like us on Facebook. From Baracoa hasta Guantanamo, even though they weren't part of the survey, social media is becoming important in the tourist-related areas. One thing that's also sort of really clear here is that, el cubano no es bobo. He or she knows how to work things. And I wanted to include this quote here because I think it's very telling. To be ostentatious, la guaperia with the chains and whatnot, all of that is like a very bad thing to do. They know how to stay under the radar. They know how to be savvy. They know how to share their wealth with locals. If there's a señora that's about to cumplir 82 años, they'll make sure that she gets something, giving something to the children in the neighborhood. All of that is sort of part of an unspoken, mundane entrepreneurial economy, what the Soviets would call the Blatt system. So we thought that was rather important. I'll let you sort of take a look at this about mundane entrepreneurship. I would anticipate in the future the role of the counties wanting to get involved and the counties wanting to say, we want to be able to have a role and get some of this tax fee back to us, because right now it's all going to the central government. So there is a bit of the Soviet-style Blatt system very much alive. It has not been studied very well. And I think future research that looks on this notion of reciprocity, compadrazgo, which is common in all the Latin American economies, is really important, and I think will provide insight into the Cuban economy. Thank you.
Good evening. I wish I had something to show you, but made an agreement with most of the subjects I work with that I would not take photos of the activity that I did observe in Havana. I originally went to Cuba last year for the first time as a 23-year-old disgruntled American student with a large amount of debt, lack of insurance, and I went to Cuba with this idea of maybe finding some sort of utopian society that you read about in books. Well, what I did find was a collective society scrambling to make ends meet, and just like me, most young Cubans had to work multiple jobs to survive while studying. So the second time around, while studying to become an anthropologist, in an ethnographic sense, I went back with interest to specifically see how the black market supported legal enterprise in Cuba. I actually just returned 2 nights ago from 2 months in Havana. So right now I'm still in the process of reacclimating myself to American style living. So in Havana, I stayed in Barrio Colon, a neighborhood that's right in the middle of central Havana in the Capitolio area. This neighborhood was great because it gave me a great amount of access to the informal economy within Cuba, which is tremendously valuable to my research. As you may know, it's difficult finding Cubans who are willing to talk about what they do to make money, even if it's legal or non-legal. Most Cubans toe the line of legal and illegal, so it was very hard for me to initially find people who are willing to talk and willing to give me honest information about what exactly that they're doing. With this, I was able to establish agreements, as I mentioned, not to take photos or not to use any information that could be detrimental to their existence or to the form that they generate income. Before I focus on 2 subjects that generously open their lives to me, I want to present a couple of examples of what I found in central Havana and also in the Vedado neighborhood in Cerro as well, both legal and illegally and how they work together. For example, a licensed food stand in central Havana that operates as an ice cream parlor also sells US dollars to CUC at a discounted rate, cheaper than the state provides. Also, there's a woman who legally rents rooms in Vedado, who rents rooms to foreign students, but has a side business selling juice, bottles of juice for 2 CUC per bottle, at a cheaper rate that you can find in the government stores, to tourists and to foreigners. A man who legally works as a truck driver for an international company in Havana, but he sells his gasoline to Cubans at a discounted price, of course, in comparison to the government. A professor at the University of Havana, who also doubles as an on-call receptionist and also an employee at a boutique in Havana Vieja, which she is paid in CUC daily, depending on how she works and when she works. A taxi driver who, in return, after his customer pays, gives his customers fake currency in money international. Cell phone repair shops that illegally sells applications, games, iPhone and Android applications, and as well as something called a package. I'm not sure if you guys are quite familiar with it, but it's basically it's a block of data, television shows, Sábado Gigante, Casa Cerrado, where you have mules that come from the United States who are able to provide this information via flash drives and external hard drives to Cubans, which they sell at a 5 CUC rate. A man who repairs printers and copy machines but buys stolen parts from a Canon warehouse in Havana. Taxi driver who buys fuel from state truck drivers but also has to worry about paying off cops who also ask for money. Generic sneaker retailers in Central Havana who sell knockoff Nikes, Adidas, Puma, and such. Seller of imported iPhones. Drug dealers who exclusively sell to the young creative class in Havana. Doctors who work as on-call private positions in order to generate more income. And also I worked with a doctor that's working in Angola who refers to himself as a new slave. Basically, the Cuban government is exploiting his labor to international countries such as Angola, Venezuela, and so on, Brazil. And the list does go on. This is what I was able to find. How am I doing on time? Okay. So I would like to introduce you to a jinetero by the name of Diablo, the alias that he goes by. It's interesting because he actually found me. I didn't find him. I was at a bar in Vedado, minding my own business, and he came up to me offering me marijuana. Salsa, music, woman, whatever I wanted. At first, I was initially a bit annoyed by his presence, but then I realized, maybe this guy could be beneficial to my research. So what Diablo does is that he works with a group of about 10 or so young Cubans who seek foreign students and who also have an insider at the university who knows the academic calendar, so they know when the students are coming and when the students are leaving. I spent 2 months with these young men, shadowing them, and eventually, by the end of my stay, I was essentially one of the guys. My nights consisted of clubs, bars, weekends at the beach.
Qué vida dura, ¿no?
Sí, very difficult life. And, as I said, I was one of the guys, and I was able to generate a sense of solidarity with this group. Although I didn't agree with their methods, I did understand why they did what they did. So going back to Diablo, he sees himself as a connector. According to him, tourists help him access information in hard currency that the government simply cannot provide him with. Tourists love dance clubs, alcohol, drugs, and sex, and he knows the direction to steer them in. As he stated, he'll do whatever it takes to make money. He claims, like tattoos, money, once you start making it, you just can't stop. And his whole body's full of tattoos. Diablo has access to marijuana, cocaine, ecstasy, prostitutes, both male and female. He's not only a drug dealer, he sells furniture that maybe falls off the back of a truck somehow to Cubans at a rate cheaper than the state can provide. He also sells seafood such as shrimp, lobster, fish to paladares, And this is also another example how the legal enterprise relies on the black market to survive. Diablo also sells clothing to Cubans, clothing that's imported by mules from the United States. He's a very fashionable man. When I met him, he was actually wearing a real Versace shirt, diamond necklace. He had everything. He was not your typical Cuban. And the thing about him, he had this sense of bravado that he wanted people to know he had money. He wanted people to know what he was about. He had no shame in what he was doing. And also, he sold stolen construction materials to legal contractors. So as you can see, he's a jack of all trades. The inspiration for his lucha is his combined experience of growing up in the special period and also working as a construction worker for the state. When he was 12 years old, his mother told him that basically you have to go out there and fight. She was not able to provide for him no longer, and he basically had to go out there and do what he had to do. He has a son in the United States, and he told me that if he had to go 2 weeks without eating or drinking to be able to come to the United States, he would do it without a question. He views himself as a Robin Hood-esque character. He steals from the rich, people who have the state, and he's able to provide the people who need it with these materials. He spoke greatly of police brutality and corruption. Quite often, he has to pay off police in order to continue to operate. He doesn't feel any shame for what he does because he feels as if the state does the same, and the state doesn't provide for him. So why not provide for yourselves? Because you cannot rely. You cannot rely on the state. If he's sick, it's not beneficial to go to the hospital. He must find a doctor and pay to get good treatment. He tried escaping Cuba last year, but the boat sank, and luckily for him, thankfully he had a life vest, so he was able to come back. But his dream is to eventually come to the United States and open up a restaurant here. To conclude, in regards to Diablo, although his work is quite taboo in regards to sex and drugs, his effort does help support legal enterprise in Cuba. My last example is a gentleman who perhaps goes by the name of Jose. He owns a taxi company in Havana, and he has 3 cars which he rents to taxistas at a rate of 36 CUC per day. Originally, sorry, I'm still in the days. It's actually kind of weird speaking English. He received the opportunity to go to Switzerland on a scholarship to do cancer research. During his time in Switzerland, he was able to save his living stipend and come back to Cuba and to buy 3 cars and start this business. Each car is under the name of himself, his mother, and his father in order to lessen the taxes they have to pay. One major problem that he spoke of is, as a business owner, it's hard to find wholesale items. So if you have cars, there's no way to buy spare parts, and this is a problem because there's no way to claim business expenses. He's actually monitored by the government right now. His phone line is tapped, and he's working also as an activist to bring down the system. Another thing that he greatly complained of is the lack of representation by the state. He feels he's actually vilified by the state for being a cuentapropista, and there's no ability to organize or to voice his discontent with the state. Unlike Diablo, he wants to stay in Cuba. He wants to reinvest in the economy, and he feels as if he shouldn't have to leave his country to live a good life. With that being said, he does live at a higher standard in comparison to other Cubans who do work for the state. As an aspiring anthropologist, I have no answers, but what I can tell you guys today is that without the black market, or what I like to call Cuba's first and main economy, the 201 legal positions authorized by the government would not be able to sustain itself. Thank you.
So, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for coming here. I just have to take a minute to connect my computer. So, that's how it works. I hope I have good pictures here. Yeah, it's coming. Keep the computer. Is it one of these F buttons? Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, so thank you again for coming and for inviting us to this panel. I'm presenting a paper that I co-authored with Orlando Justo. Unfortunately, Orlando just sent me a message that his flight to Miami was delayed. So he's getting here this afternoon. So I have to kind of wing it and present the part of the paper that we had assigned to Orlando and of course the part to myself. So basically, our paper is it's an overview of the emerging private sector in Cuba and under reform socialism. So our principal thesis is that Cuba, the transformations that are taking place, not only in terms of private self-employment, but also in terms of agriculture and other sectors of the economy, sort of put Cuba in this framework that it classifies Cuba as a reform socialist regime. So as part of the paper, the first thing we'll talk about is the principal features of reform socialism. In other words, what is reform socialism? When we talk about I heard many presentations here in the times that I had a chance to go in and sit on some of the panels. Some presentations saying, or some presenters saying that Cuba was trying to emulate the Chinese model, the Vietnamese model, the post-Soviet model, and so on. So one part of our research question was, can we look at the private self-employment in Cuba within a framework that, is there a framework that reflects the reality? So I'll talk a little bit about, why we think this is the model right now. It's a reform socialist model. The other topic is, and I think it's been alluded to in some of the presentations here, some of the reasons why the private sector expands under reform socialism. And then I'll do a very cursory overview of the private economic activities under reform socialism. And what we try to do is sort of take the framework, right, and then see which ones in Cuba fit into that framework. And then, of course, I'll talk about some of the recent developments in Cuba's emerging private sector. I think some of that in that section will second the data that Joe presented and that Ted presented. And then finally, I'll share some general conclusions, okay? So when, of course, in looking at the framework, we really don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? So we looked at the work of many scholars, but one that really stood out was Kornai and how he classifies reform socialism. And if you look at his very succinct classification of reform socialism, we're looking at a regime that's different than the classical socialist model. So one of the criteria is that the regime has made some steps towards opening in the political sphere, some gradual steps in that end. And I don't mean open democratic elections, but what this refers to, of course, is to some political flexibilization. But then the other part is decentralization of the state-owned sector, right, which basically allows more space for the private sector. So we have the expansion, qualitative and quantitative, of the non-state sector and the contraction of the state sector. But under reform socialism, Kornai noted very well, and again, there were other scholars who noted this too, that some of the features of the old regime remain there. And one that's central is that basically that you have a single party system. In the case of Cuba, the Communist Party will retain total control over political institutions. So there is that political, monopoly of the Communist Party. The other feature from the old system is that, at least in principle, centralized bureaucratic planning remains as a principal coordinating mechanism for economic activity, right? Although, but there's a clause to that, and I think many people in this room, I know from your work, you're familiar with this. There's under reform socialism, although bureaucratic planification is a central mechanism of the economy, there is room for market-oriented mechanisms. So you have a hybrid in that respect. So then the other interesting aspect here is that we recognize, and this is pretty much applicable in our view to the case of Cuba, that reform socialism suffers from these inner contradictions. And that's also another term coined by Kornai, where he writes an entire chapter about the inner contradictions of reform socialism. So for instance, one is that you have reform measures that are implemented on a piecemeal basis without a cohesive strategy, right? Without a cohesive macro strategy. So you may have some micro reform measures that are sort of thrown out there to experiment. One example in Cuba is the comercialización de productos agrícolas, how the government is experimenting with the market or quasi-market-based commercialization of agricultural products. And they're doing that not really thinking in a cohesive national strategic way, but they're doing that on an experimental basis. The other one, of course, is I think Joe had a graph, and it has this exponential growth almost that we saw for the number of self-employed workers. So that represents the evolution of the private sector. So that's another contradiction, that at the same time you have centralization and then you have the evolution of the private sector. The third one is one that's really very pronounced in Cuba, which is the predominance of the bureaucracy. And even in state enterprises, Ted mentioned, there's some state enterprises that won the lottery and they get told, everybody has to now become self-employed. But then the bureaucratic apparatus there remains. And the bureaucracy will push for not implementing, the sort of transition to self-employment. So the bureaucracy will resist these changes, the expansion of the private sector, because in some cases, some of them will be pushed against their will to the private sector. And then the fourth one is one that for the sake of time, I'm not going to get much into it, but it's really the coexistence of strong and weak forms of social organization. And what that means is basically a crisscrossing of coordination between weak forms, bureaucratic forms of organization and emerging forms of organization. So those four inner contradictions are present, we find that those are present in the case of Cuba. One that hasn't really been researched extensively is, I think most of the data on papers and books and things like that deals with the evolution of the private sector. But the first one is one that hasn't been really researched very extensively, which is to what degree, from a comparative basis, Cuba is implementing reform measures ad hoc, randomly, without a cohesive strategy, okay? So factors that promote, the expansion of the private sector, in essence, one thing that's applicable to Cuba, two main factors, right? Material incentives and more autonomy from the state. Material incentives have always been there, and I think there's research has been done that the private sector was present, formally, informally, to some degree restricted, motivated by material incentives. And when you look at the underground economy, it's not a Cuban phenomenon, it's a universal phenomenon, right? And so my point is that these material incentives would drive people to the underground economy, even in the classical period of socialism, even though it wasn't tolerated by the state. But now it's more in the open, and now it's more complex. So the connections between the strong and the weak forms of coordination are more pronounced there. The other one is more autonomy from the state. And I find that in the other area of research that I like to pursue, which is agriculture, the desire for young people to re-enter the agricultural sector it's basically driven by not only the need to make money, but driven by that desire to be more autonomous from the state. So those are two of the principal reasons that pull people into the private sector. Something else I wanted to say about this, in the case of Cuba, we have a push and pull, right? So it's not just a pull. Okay, so some of the activities that we found, and these are pretty standard, of course, farming. These are the private activities under reform socialism. So we looked at Cuba, and by the end of 2013, official data shows that private farmers have about 22% of the country's agricultural land. Okay, the cooperativas have 23.7%. So the other portion, it's in the hand of the other productive entities, which are the states and so forth and so on. So okay, so we have household farming, non-agricultural scale, small private scale activities and so on. Basically, supplemental agricultural activities, hiring third-party workers, leasing state property, the one that you see in the middle here. This one is one that Cuba is really experimenting with, which is basically beginning to think about in agriculture, in retail, and so on, how can we lease state property in a way to basically transfer, not the ownership, but the operation of the enterprises to the private sector. And then I'm going to go quickly through these. So income-generating activities, owning agricultural land, renting motorcycles, renting cars, renting taxis. I have a couple of friends who do the same thing. They are taxi owners, but they don't drive anything. They rent it out. So the expansion, a couple of key points. So the expansion of in our view, the expansion of the non-state sector, it's really one of the pillars of actualización. Okay. So the government, and I'm running out of time, so I really cannot get into all these measures and so on, but the government has implemented a series of measures to facilitate the expansion of the state sector. I understand the prohibitions, as you said, and the clawback with the DVD rentals and the importing of clothing and all that. But overall, the policies are there. And then here's some of the data. And what really comes out glaringly at you here is, if I may just jump here, the growth of self-employed workers, right? Oh, thank you. The growth of self-employed workers versus the growth of the state sector workers. And you can see, and again, this is a quantitative growth. There are issues in terms of the quality and so forth and so on. So that's the data that I think most of us here found. I'm going to conclude by saying that there's several, I talked about the contradictions of market socialism and all that, and here, we basically identified what are the principal challenges confronted by Cuban entrepreneurs. And I think that if you look at number 6, and when we look at entrepreneurship, I mean, the lack of funding, right? The lack of venture capital firms. It's impossible to think of anybody, Cuban, non-Cuban, foreign, from the moon, to create a venture capital company and to say to Cuba, to fund Cuban, emerging enterprises. I think that's a huge limitation. The other ones have been mentioned before. Another one that I want to point out, just to finish, is number 5. Even though the government says, well, we're going to lease retail spaces to the private sector, the quality of the spaces, some of the employees don't even want to lease from the government. That's a huge constraint, the deteriorated state conditions of the retail spaces, the disrepair of the state facilities and all that. And so the challenges are there, but our main conclusion is, of course, that if you compare it with the old classical model, certainly in terms of the growth and the expansion of the private sector, Cuba has adopted already, has moved towards a reform socialist model. Thank you.
Because he didn't get anything. I did.
I'm going to be commenting on the first two papers. Thank you, I appreciate that. I actually like these two papers, and I don't really have any negative things to say about them. So consequently, all my comments are directed at Ted. Joe can go to sleep. Let me say the three things that I sort of most liked about these papers. First of all, they both provide a vivid description of how Cuba's emerging private sector has developed in the face of a difficult and fluctuating legal and social context. And this requires much more than simply a recitation of facts and events. It requires that the facts be woven into a story with a point of view that gives them coherence, but that does not prevent a priori other interpretations. And both papers, I think, do quite well. This is sort of a methodological point. It's one of my hobby horses now. And I think that, especially in the social sciences, but I suspect in a bunch of other areas in the sciences today, we put all this emphasis on finding that the only acceptable empirical work is the one that is statistical work done with large data sets and stuff like that, and we forget that any science, if it's going to explain anything, should also be able to explain whatever is in front of our faces, the basic things that we can touch and feel. I think a theory of physics that can explain how gravity bends light, but people don't know how to, don't think that it's important for them to explain how a baseball travels after it leaves my hand, I think is a poor application of that science. I think economists have forgotten to think about, and other social sciences too, to think about all the stuff that's really around us. And this paper provides us plenty of that, and it provides a service that I think is underappreciated in the social sciences for people like myself who do applied theoretical work, is that we don't have the time to go out and actually experience all these things everywhere. We want to be able to think about how we would explain some of the stuff, and it really is useful to have someone who can give it to us in a coherent way, and yet, even though they may be expressing a point of view behind it, not one that actually completely obscures the facts in such a way that we can use them for our own interpretations. I think that was very good about these papers. Both papers also put forth an expansive view of entrepreneurship, which is something which I agree with. And I do suspect, however, that they underestimate how widespread that view of entrepreneurship is in economics. For example, my advisor, the late great Gary Becker, taught several generations of Chicago economists to view the household as a production unit. So the individual, the household, everything is actually a production unit with everything that entails, including entrepreneurship. And that whole tradition goes back to Adam Smith, and presumably even before that, that entrepreneurship really is a very widespread activity that it's innate in all of us, and we all tend to do it, some are better than others, but it's there in every aspect of life. The other thing, third thing I liked is that both papers, I think, do a good job of showing the back and forth that has occurred as liberalization is followed by retrenchment, followed by some liberalization and so forth, and how the sector tries to adjust to it and so forth. I think that's an important thing. Now let me give you some sort of the substantive comments. I think that their view of entrepreneurship we can think of this as sort of an example of creativity applied to production. In fact, the young Marx believed that the only creative force in the whole economy was the entrepreneur. That's the only individual who actually created something over and above what was there, and simply not just transformed things. I think, and I do agree with this expansive view of entrepreneurship, but I think what's important is how expansive how the entrepreneurship expresses itself. So I think they're completely right in saying that we find entrepreneurship in mundane activities. We find it as people work within a bureaucratic system, a government-controlled sector. You find it everywhere. You find it in academia. You find it, that kind of activity. However, in terms of being socially productive, it depends how society is structured and how that entrepreneurship is expressed. But that expressed in these economies is clear. I'm going to refer to several papers of mine. I'm sorry that they're all mine papers, but I'm not trying to sell myself here. But I wrote a paper a few years back in Review of Economic Dynamics in 2009 with Claustro Bajona. It originally arose out of a paper that I presented at ASCE, and in that paper we look at entrepreneurship as being this productive characteristic that everybody has, but some people have more than others, and the most people who have the most ability as entrepreneurs become entrepreneurs and run enterprises, and other people turn out to be workers. And when you go to a socialist economy in that model, the entrepreneurs now have to use their time and skills, their entrepreneurship essentially, to try to lobby for resources within the government sector. So you can see that, in that model, for example, the activity, entrepreneurship, is also there in a centrally planned economy, but now it's being used in a socially unproductive way. It's being used to get their share of the pie of resources as opposed to being productive. And as a consequence, because entrepreneurship effort is being shifted over, the productivity tends to decline. So that I think is an example that you guys may want to take a look at that paper. But entrepreneurship may not always be socially, in that case you can see it not being necessarily socially productive, and this gives us a rise to a problem, which is entrepreneurship fungible? In other words, are the kinds of entrepreneurships that develop in a certain kind of system, do they transfer well to when the system changes so that it's still functional? So for example, let's say you take someone who is a criminal entrepreneur, and here in the U.S., say, who runs a criminal operation, and that person sees the light, becomes a born-again Christian or something, and decides that he's going to leave his criminal ways and become a legitimate person. Well, does he become now a successful legal entrepreneur? Are those skills that he developed, breaking people's legs when they didn't pay and stuff like that, are they somehow fungible or not? I don't know the answer to this. In another paper that I presented a long time ago with Jorge Sanguinetti here at ASCE, we looked at various generations of Cuban Americans and how self-employed, what was the frequency of self-employment. And we found that the early immigrants had very high levels of self-employment, over 20%. But those numbers really plummeted afterwards. And they also plummeted for the generation that was born in the US. The only exception was Mariel, which had pretty substantial levels, but that can be explained perhaps for other reasons, in the sense that they came all at once, and there may not have been work opportunities for them. I've heard other more nefarious reasons for it, but the point is that if you exclude the Mariel thing, you can see that it was the big group that first came early, which of course included a lot of self-employed people and business people from Cuba, that in fact were the ones who had been that. So if entrepreneurship is very common, very widespread in Cuban society, afterwards it didn't necessarily translate to that here. Now, there may be a select sample, though I would have thought the selection would have gone in the other direction. But I think one concern is just how fungible it is. Are the kinds of skills that were described for this individual, Diablo, who wants to come to the U.S., how is he going to be able to transfer them here? The mentality that develops in a system where I have to beat the system. The system is corrupt, the system is illegitimate, and my goal in life is to beat it any way I can. How is that compared to presumably what exists in a situation where we have certain levels of trust in people, certain levels of belief that the system is legitimate, and therefore the system does not have to be constantly monitoring us to make sure that we abide by it. I remember an incident that I had. I remember an incident. I was in not a very good part of town, and I had to stop into a grocery store to do some shopping, and to buy something real quickly. And I see this young man whose pants are about, halfway down his butt, teenager probably, older teenager, with a bottle of soft drink in his hand, and he's looking across the lines. And it struck me, he's looking how to get out away so that he's not seen by anybody with what he's bought. And he's walking across, and then the guy makes a dash, and I go, there he goes. But no, what he made a dash for was the a teller that had no line, because that was the some sort of special services there. But that also doubles as it'll also take people who buy there. So he went there. He could have gotten away with his Coke, and yet he went there and he paid for it. And here was some ghetto kid doing this, and I had thought that he was going to try to get away without paying for it. And in fact, he could easily have done so. Nobody would have even seen him in the supermarket, and yet he went and paid for it. That kind of mentality apparently is very widespread, and we forget how useful it is for people, for the most part, to be law-abiding, for the most part, to be trusting, and so forth. When you grow up in a very different environment where from the get-go, you have to be not law-abiding, you have to be looking for opportunities to cheat the system and so forth. I don't know how well one translates that into a sort of a market system, or certainly one that works well. The last point, I have a few more, but I'm running out of time, but let me make just at least one point here. Again, many years ago, I think it was reprinted in Perspectives on Economic Reforms in Cuba that was edited by Jorge Perez Lopez and Matias Travieso Diaz. But it was presented in ASCE a few years before that, so something like in the middle 90s. I think it may have been the first one to propose this thesis that the path of China was not open to Cuba, and I argued why it would be the case. And my argument there was that the type of loss of control that would come with a significant move to a market economy would require the possibility of substantial repression if required, and that China was in a position to do that, and in fact did so in Tiananmen Square, but that Cuba was not in a position to do that because of its size, its relative proximity to the U.S., the large Cuban American community here, and so forth. And I thought that would be important, especially while the Castro brothers were, alive and so forth. I still think that motivation is there. I believe it's becoming less important as the Castro brothers are fade away here. And in what it looks like from reading these papers is what you're seeing now is that there's been a movement toward much more traditional rent-seeking arrangements that you see in so many countries in the world. This is pervasive. In many countries, it's rampant. In the U.S. now we have these things like this fight between taxi companies and Uber. This is everywhere. In some countries, like in Peru in the 1980s, it was tremendous. In fact, I would recommend the authors may want to look at the literature, especially things like The Other Path by Hernando de Soto. What they describe in Cuba today has a lot of similarities, not identical to, but a lot of similarities to the informal markets that have arisen in these very bureaucratic countries in the developed world. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I unfortunately didn't receive any of the papers, so I'm going to base no criticism of anyone, I'm going to base my comments and observations based on the presentations, and as a result, I may have missed something in the paper. First, a general comment regarding this, the state sector, as I know it, has always been seen as having low wages relative to what private entrepreneurs would be able to earn. As a result, as an economist, what one wants to grapple with is why don't you have this flow of workers from the state sector moving into the private sector? Because there's been mention about this conflict between the state sector and the private sector, but it would seem to be just the fact that the private sector now becomes open, it should lead to this movement. So the question is, if you don't observe these large movements, there must be some very large compensating differentials in the state sector. Maybe basically, you don't have to work. And as a result, yes, I'm being paid a very low salary, but at the same time, I have all this available time to actually be able to do a lot of other activities which may be generating income, and it's not being reported by obtaining licenses and so on. So for those individuals who are doing this type of research, it would be important to see this, because again, when you observe these, what would appear to be a disequilibrium, you have to try to explain why, in fact, it maybe there are some equilibrating forces that are involved in these observations. In terms of, and by the way, I loved all the presentations. In terms of, for example, Scarpacci's paper, I saw some things that economists have always been hesitant to use survey data because of the fact that it's not randomly generated. So there is a tendency to be self-selected. And so if in fact the survey data, or if the entrepreneurs are self-selected, then what happens is your data, your, in a sense, means, and all the statistics that are generated from this are in fact biased. So, but even that being the case, because obviously, it's very important to have this data. I don't know if in your paper you saw that in terms of the comparisons between the state workers, for example, doctors and the entrepreneurs, and also the general population, really what over time, it's important to look at not only the real income, correct, for the purchasing power over those years, three time periods that you look at, but also in terms of net income. Because what happens is, yes, those entrepreneurs are earning larger incomes than the rest of, than doctors and the other employees, but maybe after tax, again, they may be at this point the equilibrating forces that they're the same. So correcting, it'd be important to correct for these high taxes, in particular licensing fees. I'd like one thing about also the data that you presented regarding doctors, and is the fact that you see, which, by the way, looking at it as a percentage of each, of whether doctors' salaries or the rest of the population, at least you get rid of this the purchasing power issue, because now you're comparing, assuming they're all face the same prices in the marketplace, and so it's a useful way of looking at it. But what's interesting is, if you look at doctors' salary, the initial period, it seemed like these cuentapropistas were earning a lot relative to doctors, but towards the tail end, you notice that the doctor's salaries start to rise. Is that a consequence of Cuba's medical exports? And so that it would be interesting to see whether that actually has led to an increase in, because if it's led to an increase in the income of doctors. Mario's paper, the Chinese model, there's something, my Mandarin is non-existent, but I think it's called hukuwa. What it does is, in China, if you think, and it's very similar, the application to Cuba you could see how you could make an adjustment. You have an urban sector where the workers are legal in that sector. As a result, they could use schools, they could use hospitals, and so on. And then you have this illegal sector, which is these workers that are moving in from the rural to the urban sector. They're illegal, so they don't have access to any of these services. Okay, so as a result, what happens is the equilibrium in the labor market there is that these workers, the illegal workers, are earning substantially lower than the legal workers. Okay, so in a sense, just the fact that the Chinese have outlawed this rural to urban migration leads to these workers being implicitly taxed, these illegal workers being implicitly taxed by these policies. So for Cuba, it's an interesting thing to look at this as you know, because as an example. In fact, the other thing about the Chinese system is that these workers, since the Chinese economy is much more open to the importation of capital goods, these workers, at least, they obtain jobs in construction and so on, where they're able to work with all this capital that the Cuban workers are not able to, right? So and I think that this is important. I think you said in terms of venture capital in Cuba. I think a major problem in the development of this sector is really tied to, and we talked about it yesterday, probably Cuba's exchange rate policy, and the fact that they're really concerned with opening up and the importation of capital goods, which is so critical, but again, very concerned with the implications for their balance of payments. Finally, I want to make some general observations about this whole area of entrepreneurship in Cuba. What happens is it's important to distinguish between short-term contracts and long-term contracts. And when we negotiate and I buy from someone, if I believe this individual is going to be there for a very long time, and what happens is you have this ability to repeatedly visit this individual. So since you have this repeat business, the entrepreneur doesn't have an incentive to overcharge you or provide you with for goods of low quality, because they realize that you're not going to ever return. So in a sense, when you wonder, why isn't that, you know, I don't know anything about mechanics, but when I go to my mechanic, he doesn't seem to overcharge me. And the reason is, I think he doesn't have an incentive because he's interested in the long term, the present discounted value of his profits, and not the one-shot deal that he would gain from screwing me and telling me that my motor needs to be replaced. So, and so I think it's overlooked that the fact that whatever Cuba institutes right now, it should be, in a sense, viewed by those in this particular sector as being permanent, so that all of a sudden issues like of trust, exchange, okay, can be developed, because Cuba doesn't have a system of contracts to begin with. So all these contracts have to be primitive, like in the Middle Ages, based on who your family was, how, whether you'd marry a woman if her mother had 14 kids because she was well genetically prone to be able to reproduce like her mother. So these are types of things that in economies like this, which are not, the contracts are not developed, we have to resort to these types of mechanisms. And for Cuba, it's interesting because with the movement, the immigration of people leaving Cuba, and what has happened is the family structure, to some degree, the value of the family, of that trademark, the family, has diminished. And as a result, what happens is, I think that in the Cuban mentality, you have this child, and when the kid's like right now 10 years old, and he's like the guy you met, he's, you know, un bandolero, a guy que, you know, really a sharp guy, he's encouraged. That's a great thing. He could screw you over and make money. Whereas in, you know, in other times, you would say the family structure would try to restrain this type of activity in order to preserve the family name and be able to use this reputation in future business dealings. So keep in mind, talking also, Becker was on my dissertation committee as well at Chicago, you know, this issue of also household economics, in this case, the value of reputation, which the family provides, which seems in the case of Cuba to maybe have disappeared, or at least diminished dramatically. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you to all the presenters.
You will find a bunch of surprises. And if you could start making questions, you would be surprised. Now, second, these artisans are the first to have the opportunity to create a lobby, a new organization, Asociación Cubana de Artesanos. Never existed before. It's new. And it's working as a lobby. And they are a powerful lobby in La Habana Vieja, okay? Where big money is running up and down. So this is something that we should look at. And let's say bed and breakfast. We're talking here about 30% of the tourist industry. We're talking about people who are making thousands every day. We're talking about people that are traveling abroad, having a great life, okay? Sending money to Miami, etc. Yes, sending money to Miami. That would be a big surprise for some of you. Okay, but that is taking place. You're not looking at the Cubans who are returning to Cuba by the hundreds every month, okay, and investing in all kinds of activities. You're missing one of the most important sectors in the Cuban economy today. One of the weakest sectors in the state economy is everything connected to light industry. Okay? Who makes the furnitures? Who provides the shoes, the belts, the handbags, the wallets? You look to Havana, and what is the most important feature you see in every house? Fences, metal doors. Have you explored that possibility? The amount of money behind the metal works in Cuba today, we're talking about millions, okay? And that's just a few examples. Thank you.
Listen, great panel. Thank you very much. As far as I can tell, this is the first time that we mention in this meeting the black market. Yesterday, the emprendedora said, no, we never heard of that. You know, we cannot buy anything from the black market because it will cost our business. So that was very interesting to me. One specific problem on question on that for Ellis is, you mentioned that there was an ice cream maker selling dollars in the black market. They were selling the dollars at less than 24-1. Is that the correct? And a question, two other questions, quick questions. I read about there's a new wholesale market just outside Havana that was supposed to have started the last couple of months. Do you know anything about that? And I take it that the cuentapropistas cannot really incorporate themselves. There's no members of the private sector that could form a corporation today under the tax law that I will be discussing later this afternoon. There's a corporation tax. The cuentapropistas are not allowed, I think.
Thank you, everybody, for the panel. I also wanted to frame my question in the context of something that came up yesterday in the panel on exchange rates. That was Augusto de la Torre made the comment that when we have a dual exchange rate regime, often we find this mismatch between what's beneficial for the individual and what's beneficial for society as a whole. And my question is directed primarily to Mr. Joseph Scarpacci, but also to the panel as a whole. And what struck me about your presentation was this declining trend in education based on the entrepreneurs with whom you interacted and that you interviewed. And so typically in a society where self-employed are not restricted to specific occupations, we see a government trying to increase the number of years of education for individuals with the logic that education leads to researchers or people who have innovative ideas, and then they can be a motor for economic growth and employment in society. And so the question that I have for the panel is that as this trend continues, or if the trend continues for self-employed that have less education, what would happen as Cuba opens up more occupations, and will the self-employed or will the individuals in the society then have the technical capacity to assume occupations that require higher levels of education?
Thank you. I think we'll let the panel respond, and then we'll take another round. Anyone?
The microphone? Sure.
Very briefly, Domingo, in 2013, there was a rumor that the tax rate in the private sector was going to jump to 40% at the end of the year from 10%. All the artists, and these are high-end artists in Havana with whom I spoke, said that they were putting pressure on UNIAC. Abel Prieto, who's now an advisor to Raul, the former head of UNIAC, basically squashed that. So there is some indirect, because there are millionaires that are in the art community. So indirectly, that's a policy mechanism that's interesting to explore, but you can have everybody speaking off the record. In terms of the education, young lady, you know, these are trabajos timberiches. These are negocios that are just sort of, they're solo enterprises. And so I think the notion, the strong and positive relationship between education and sophistication, as long as there's single enterprises and there aren't SMEs, small and medium enterprises, I think that logic where we would expect more sophisticated jobs to come forth, you can't have medium-sized businesses. So you can't have two engineers or two technicians getting together. You have to do it with your different licensing. So it's an interesting question, but legally in the case of Cuba, that strong and positive association isn't going to manifest itself because they're only solo enterprises. So over time, you did see education drive, but these are viudas selling jugo or mermeladas or pastelitos. So the level of sophistication in some of these jobs is not really great. On the other hand, I had welders, I had people with aquariums, breeding fish. So it really ran the spectrum, but that's really a topic for another paper.
I think in Joe's paper, he was looking at the education of the people in his sample. And part of the reason why that changed is because as the restrictions change, as become more or less restrictive, you get people coming in at different margins. Yeah. And so when it became more restrictive, the ones who probably were least profitable are the ones who leave first, and the ones who remain were more educated. And when you open it up again, you get people who have less education. But for the economy as a whole, the idea between there being a connection between having education as a measure of human capital makes sense in a market economy where people are having an eye into what they go into depending on sort of the earnings. In a country where the earnings by occupation are so distorted, in other words, they're so equal, so that it doesn't make much difference, the areas in which people go to may have very little economic sense. So you could end up having a nation of art historians. Nothing wrong with art history, but you don't want to have the whole country being art historians. So if you look at total years of education, it's not necessarily a very good measure of the actual productivity of that human capital. And so what happened since the special period is we've seen a decline in formal years of education, partly because it doesn't pay to become a doctor again. Who wants to become a doctor sort of to practice where? So you end up having people being more productive in other sectors. So I think in the case of Cuba, the years of education is not a particularly good measure of the human capital that people have.
In response to it was actually buying dollars and then changing them into CUC. The official rate from the government is 83 cents per dollar. This business, they were offering 92 cents on the dollar, which is quite beneficial for a Cuban perhaps coming back from Miami with dollars.
For cooks.
Yeah, for cooks, yeah.
Mario. ¿Se oye?
Sí.
You mentioned the percentage of land under the control of the private, the government. Do you have statistics about the production of those? Because I remember many years ago, Fidel in a speech said that the private sector with much less land had produced much more than. So that would be nice to have.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions and ask them to respond.
I just would like to affirm what some of the members of the panel said. First of all, Elias, your description of the Cuban economy is what I remembered 14 years ago. Came right home to roost. It's interesting, I didn't find that in my last visit, and it may just because I was moving in different circles. Joe, your results are exactly the same that I found. My work was not nearly as intensive as yours or systematic, but quickly, taxes. I didn't find people complaining about taxes. They were high, especially the monthly tax, and that may have made a difference whether people were in business or not, but it didn't seem to affect their operations once they did it, and the income tax didn't seem to be an issue at all. Corruption. Interestingly, people seem to think the inspectors were right on top of it, were out there checking on them, and they didn't dare violate the law. I also found that true in some of the sellers. For instance, when I was there before, people talked about the illegal meat sales, which went on everywhere. When I talk to the people producing cattle now, they said the inspectors are here every month. I don't dare do that. I talked to fishermen on the Almadrares River, and I remember you bought the fish in the black market, and I guess you still can, but they were very clear. They're making good money now. They're not gonna rock the boat, and that's of course what we heard from the Quintapapistas yesterday. Wholesale markets, absolutely everybody complains about it, even with the new market and thing. I actually had a interesting observation sitting in the bed and breakfast when the owner was talking with some new people interested in expanding a restaurant someplace else. And they must have spent an entire afternoon talking about how difficult it was to go out and find all the materials every day for what they needed. And I heard this all over the place. Wholesale markets are a desperate need. And finally is that everybody needs capital. Everybody's looking for capital, and everybody loves foreign investors. And I think there's a great deal of small amounts of foreign investment money coming in all sorts of informal ways, and people paying their loans back to Miami. Thank you.
One more question?
Let me just intervene really quick because I have to go out and check on the lunch and everything. I'm trying to be entrepreneurial here myself. Arch and I wrote a book, Entrepreneurial Cuba, that I mentioned that my paper came from, and I just gave you guys a little propaganda for a much discounted copy of that book. So I have more here if anybody wants one. And I'm going to let these guys answer the tough questions, and I'm going to escape.
Let me just say, let me say something about the comment on the taxes. I haven't had much time to think about this other than a few hours and in the sessions here. But I think part of the reason why taxes, can people hear me okay? Part of the reason why taxes may be playing this different role in Cuba is that a lot of the taxes are lump sum. Lump sum, first of all, don't affect you at the margin, which is really what you tend to feel. So, if you make $10,000, you get that minus the taxes, and if you make $1 million, you get that minus the same taxes. So, in that sense, that people may, and also, lump sum taxes are much more difficult to cheat on. It's much more difficult for an inspector to come back and say, well, that's all there was to collect. Well, no, if the person is in operation, you have to come back with X amount of money collected from them. And so that may be one, in fact, may be a reason why they have the lump sum tax. It's also the fact that they have very little way of control. The other part is that even if you do have high taxes sometimes at the margin, it's not clear that those are always reported. So in fact, the real tax rates, the marginal tax rates may in fact be much lower than you actually see. And that's where the corruption is taking place, but no one's going to notice that.
Yeah, I wanted to, thank you. Oscar, the question about production in agriculture by the private sector. The numbers report cooperativas de crédito y servicios y privados. So CCS and private farmers are bunched together. In some areas of agriculture, the combined, they account for about 80% of output, 50%, 80% of output, 50% of output, 70% of output, and I do have those numbers for a different paper and all that. But the new law, well, not that new, came in 2012, the Decreto Ley 300, Decree Law 300, basically allows the usufructuarios, the new private farmers in usufruct, to align themselves with the CCS and with the CPAs because of the so-called non-state agricultural producers in Cuba. The CPAs are declining because the owners of the CPAs, when they were founded in 1975, are dying, they're getting old, and the contracts are not renewable. So this is a way to, to push back on the decline of that form of agricultural production. But if you put together UBPCs, CCS, CPAs, and private farmers, then you have an even higher percentage of land ownership and production. But they don't move in a positive correlation. In some areas, the cooperatives have a lot of land, but they don't have that much production. So it's quite mixed. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you again to all the panelists and to all of you. And of course,